With Chapter 21, we'll be looking at body fluids and electrolyte balance in body fluids, as well as the way that the body maintains homeostasis around pH, what we call acid-base balancing. And here in this first video, we'll be looking specifically at water and at the electrolytes that are dissolved in water. So when we think about what body fluids are, they're composed almost exclusively of water plus whatever dissolved solutes there are in it. So the major fluid or the major component of fluid is water. And we find that women have about a 52% of their body is composed of water, while in men, about 63% of the body is composed of water. So why is it that we see this difference? What's up with the difference between the two sexes? So as you're thinking about that, I want you to consider what we learned about the muscular system back last semester, what we learned about the skeletal system, and then finally stuff that we learned back when we were talking about tissues. Okay, so what is the difference between body water content in men and women? So estrogen causes in women a greater deposition of body fat, of adipose tissue, while men have less body fat. So there's one thing that drives down women's water content is that they have greater percentage of these cells that are primarily filled with lipid. Men have more muscle in their bodies, and muscle is got a lot of water in it. So it's primarily those two factors that are driving what we see of men having more water in their bodies than women do. It turns out that infants, babies, have even more water in their body than men do. And it's because their brains are so daggone large compared to the rest of their body, primarily. And the fact that they also have low body fat and very, relatively speaking, low bone density. So all these things tend to make babies even higher in water content. So what are the solutes that we find in body fluids? There are two, we can class solutes into two different groups, the electrolytes and the non-electrolytes. Electrolytes are salts that break down when they dissolve in water, they break apart, producing ions. And let's just make sure that everybody's clear on what an ion is. Ions are charged particles because they either have given away electrons or they've gained electrons. So some example ions are sodium. And sodium has a positive charge because it's given away one electron. Often, the place that sodium gives its electron away is to the chloride ion, that's chlorine, that has an extra electron. So sodium donates its extra electron to chlorine, and that makes the chloride ion, which has got a negative charge to it. Some other important ions include calcium, magnesium. Both of these atoms, when they ionize, they give away 2 electrons, and that gives them a net +2 or 2 positive charge. So electrolytes are salts, and when they dissolve, they break apart into their component ions. Non-electrolytes are materials that when they dissolve do not break apart into ions. So non-electrolytes include things like glucose, the proteins that dissolve in body fluids. Those are all things that when they dissolve, they are only one particle dissolved versus something like sodium chloride that breaks apart into 2 particles. So electrolytes have greater osmotic power than the non-electrolytes because when they dissolve, they create at least 2 different particles. And osmotic power, I know this is a weird thing. It's not about the weight or the mass of the materials. It's all about the number of particles. So when we talk about concentrations and the osmotic effects of different concentrations of solutions or solutes dissolved in water, What we're really looking at is how many particles there are. That's what gives something its osmotic power. So the more particles it breaks into, the greater the osmotic power that a electrolyte might have. So sodium chloride, when it dissolves in water, it produces 2 particles. Magnesium chloride, on the other hand, when it breaks apart, it makes 3 particles. So it's got 1/3 more osmotic power than sodium chloride does. Whereas something like glucose, C6H12O6, when you dissolve it in water, no breaking apart. So this has half the osmotic power that salt has, because salt breaks into 2 particles, while glucose remains a single particle. Okay, so I know that that is not always a real intuitive thing, but it's a chemistry thing, that it's the particles, the number of particles, that gives the solution its osmotic strength. So we can talk about where the body fluids are found as fluid compartments, the regions where the different fluids are found. And we can think of 2 compartments in the body. There's intracellular fluids, so the fluids that we find within the cells, and extracellular fluid compartments. These are the fluids that are found outside the cells. And so if you think back to when we talked about cells, the purpose of the function of the cell membrane is to regulate the movement of materials across, either into the cell or out of the cell. So that's one of those functions of the cell membrane, and it creates, it allows for homeostasis in either one of those 2 fluid compartments. So we can control what the internal environment of the cell is like, and that then winds up controlling what the external environment for the cell is like as well. So let's look first at the intracellular fluid compartment. This is where we find about 2/3, about 63% of all of the body fluids. And in composition, it is relatively high compared to extracellular fluids in potassium, magnesium, the phosphate ion, and this is going to become important eventually as we talk about buffer systems, because phosphate ion is involved in buffering pH. The sulfate ion as well, and there's the sulfate buffer system as well. So we see higher concentrations of potassium, magnesium, phosphate, and sulfate within a cell, and compared to the extracellular fluids, lower concentrations of sodium, chlorine, calcium. This is carbonic acid. Oh, actually, I'm sorry. That should not have a 2 at it because it's negative. This is the bicarbonate ion. You've learned that one already. So we see differences in the dissolved solutes that are found in the intracellular fluid compartment compared to the extracellular fluid compartment. 2 of these we've already learned about, potassium and sodium, because remember the sodium-potassium pump. So here is a cell membrane, and with the sodium-potassium pump we see transport proteins that every time you feed them an ATP, they move 2 sodiums out, and they bring back into the cell 3 potassiums. Let's put this on this side. 3 K pluses. So for every ATP we give to the sodium-potassium pump, we move out. Oh, that's weird. We move out 2 sodiums, and we move back in 2 potassiums. And so that's what sets up this difference between potassium and sodium. And then other characteristics will help to control what it's like outside. When we move sodium out, it turns out that chlorine kind of tends to follow sodium, and so it goes out too. All right, so also we know that there are greater protein concentrations inside the cell than there are out there in blood plasma. So there's a lot of additional proteins found inside a cell than there are plasma proteins. The extracellular fluid compartment, well, that's all the fluids outside the cell, and it's the remainder of the fluid in the body. So if there's 63% of our body fluid is inside cells, then the other 37% must be outside the cells. And these extracellular fluids include interstitial fluid, blood plasma, the lymph that gets squeezed into the lymphatic vessels, and then finally what are called the transcellular fluids. These are fluids that are separated from these fluids here by epithelial layers. So we're talking there about CSF, the cerebrospinal fluid, the aqueous and vitreous humors of the eyeball, synovial fluids that are found inside a joint, and serous fluids that are found in the pleural cavity, the cavity around the heart, and the peritoneal cavity around the organs of the abdominopelvic cavity. So those are the three areas where we have serous fluids. Pericardial cavity, that's the heart one. I just couldn't come up with a name there for a second. Okay, so the intracellular, this should say extra, dadgummit. You don't see all the mistakes until you get into it. So the extracellular fluids are these fluids. And in composition, they tend to be higher in everything that the intracellular fluids were low in. So we see higher sodium outside. We've talked about why now. Higher chloride, higher calcium ions, and higher, here we go again, higher bicarbonate, HCO3 ions than the intracellular fluids. And lower potassium, magnesium, phosphate, sulfate. And then finally, the blood, while it has less proteins in it than the cells do, it has the most proteins of any of the extracellular fluids. So if body cells have the most protein in their fluids, then blood would be second in that line, and then everything else would be way far behind. So water or fluids move between the compartments. So we move water from the cell out into the extracellular fluids and vice versa. And it moves because of a number of different forces. Hydrostatic pressure is one. Remember, this is fluid pressure. So we're talking about blood pressure at the arterial end of the capillary networks, forcing fluids out of the blood. And tissue pressure around the lymphatic vessels also moves body fluids into the lymphatic capillaries. So lots of ways that hydrostatic pressure can move fluids around in the body. We've talked a lot about how osmotic pressure, this is last semester though, moves materials around. Oh, I guess we talked about it at the beginning of this semester too. So we've talked about colloid osmotic pressure at the venous side of capillary networks, drawing in fluids from the body, from interstitial fluid. So all of those plasma proteins help to draw in fluids into capillaries. Osmosis between tissue cells and the interstitial fluids moves fluid a lot. And as the sodium-potassium pump moves stuff from one side, it moves sodium, again, here's the cell membrane, we're moving out go 2 sodium, and in comes 3 potassium. As we move that, notice we're moving out 2 particles, moving in 3 particles. That's also going to draw water into the cells. So that's one way that we move fluid into the cells, then equalizing osmotic pressure on both sides of that cell membrane. Okay, so let's talk now about water balance. Water balance is a lot like the nutrient balances, the energy balances that we talked about in the chapter on nutrition. Water balance exists, or we are in a state of water balance, when water intake is the same as water output. And it's our thirst center, there's an area in the hypothalamus, that creates the desire to seek out water and to bring water into the body. So how do we get water into our body? Well, of course, drinking. And that's about 60%, a little bit more than half of water comes in with the fluids that we drink. But we also get a lot of water in the moist foods that we eat. So if you eat raisins, yes, that's a dried fruit, but there's still some water in it. It's not like a hard little rock. There's still some fluid in that. If you eat oatmeal for breakfast, you're getting a whole lot of water with oatmeal. So any of the moist foods, like if you cook up some rice, you've now moistened that rice, you're going to get a lot of water with the rice that you are eating. And then about 10% of the water that we get in the body comes not from consuming any kind of water at all, but what we talk about is the water of metabolism. So in the process of burning glucose with oxygen, we make, and it takes 6 O2s if we balance that equation, we're going to produce 6 CO2 and 6 water molecules. And so there are some animals out there in the world, kangaroo rats that live in the desert, that never sip on water at all. They get all of their water needs met because they eat seeds, and as they break down all the nutrients that are in those seeds, they produce water as a side product. So it's possible to get a lot of, 10% of the water needs met just because we're busy converting glucose into carbon dioxide and water in order to get the energy out of that glucose to make ATP. Because, of course, in this equation, we also produce ATP. So that's where we get our water from. Where does our water go? Well, we pee out a lot of it, of course. We have not yet talked about the urinary system, but what we'll see when we get there is that there is a hormone called ADH, antidiuretic hormone. That's a dash there between anti and diuretic. So ADH is antidiuretic hormone. That's a hormone that prevents us from losing a lot of water in, that prevents us from losing a lot of water in our urine. So when we have a lot of ADH in the body, then our pee is really concentrated. If we have lots of water in the body, then we don't produce a lot of ADH and we make a really dilute fluid, or a pee. Fecal material also carries out moisture, or wet water. Sweat, both the sweat that we feel, that's what we refer to as sensible perspiration. And then there's also just all the time, especially if we're in a dry environment, we are evaporating water from our skin surface and we don't even notice it. And we talk about that as insensible perspiration because we're not able to sense that we're losing it. And then as we breathe out air from our lungs, especially when we breathe through the mouth, we're losing moisture that way too. If we breathe through the nose, we lose less water than breathing through the mouth allows. So water balance requires that water intake and water output be equal to each other. If we drink more than we're peeing out, we're retaining fluids. That's positive water balance. If we pee out more than we drink, then we are losing body fluids. Or if we pee out, sweat out more than we drink in, then we're losing water from the body, and that is negative water balance. So we also seek to achieve balance in electrolytes. So electrolytes come in primarily through food, but they can also be found in the fluids and other beverage, the water and the other beverages that we may drink. And so the third way that we can get them through food, we can get them in the water and beverages that we drink, and then also chemical reactions in the body will release electrolytes. So some of the important electrolytes include sodium and potassium, involved in action potentials and in muscle contractions. Calcium, remember that was involved in muscle contractions and also in allowing neurotransmitter to be released from an axon terminal. Magnesium, important in many enzymes. Chlorine, mostly as important as a means of creating osmotic pressure. The phosphate and bicarbonate ions, and hydrogen ion, which is also going to be closely related to acid, because hydrogen ions are acids in the body. So that's where we get electrolytes from. How do we lose electrolytes from the body? Primarily through urine. That's the primary means of regulating the electrolytes in our body fluids. But we can also lose electrolytes in sweat and in fecal materials and in tears, but that's a very small proportion of electrolyte loss occurs in tears. So how do we control water balance? There's two primary means that we can control water and electrolyte. Well, actually, there's more than two. What am I saying? We have multiple ways to control water and electrolyte balance. But there are two primary hormones that are involved here. Aldosterone is one. Aldosterone is secreted by the cortex of the adrenal glands. So if these are the kidneys, right up above the kidneys is kind of a pyramid or cone-shaped organ called the adrenals, or the adrenal glands. And the outer rind of the adrenals, this area here, not the adrenal medulla, but the outer rind of the adrenal glands secretes a hormone called aldosterone, and it causes the kidneys to reabsorb sodium and potassium. Parathyroid hormone is also involved in electrolyte balance. It's released by the parathyroid glands. So if this is the thyroid gland, looks like a little butterfly kind of, and it's right in the same region as the larynx. On the reverse side of it, there are four little nubs of tissue, two on each side of the thyroid gland, called the parathyroid glands, and they release this parathyroid hormone, PTH. PTH, when it's released, will stimulate the activity of osteoclasts. Ooh, osteoclasts. Do they break up bone or do they build bone? Clasts clash with the bones, if you remember that. And so when they break down bone material, they release calcium ions into the blood. And then they also cause the intestines to absorb a lot more calcium out of the fluids, or out of the foods that are in our digestive system. And they also cause the kidneys to reabsorb or to bring back into the body calcium ions and to excrete out phosphorus ions or phosphate ions. So we get rid of, and I didn't do good, sorry about that, didn't do a good job of doing that. I forgot to put 4 as a subscript and 3 minus. So it's PO4, so it's phosphate is 1 phosphorus plus 4 oxygens, and it's got a -3 charge, so it has 3 extra electrons. So this phosphate ion also gets excreted with the kidneys as a result of parathyroid hormone, which makes sense. We are breaking down bones. Bones are composed of calcium and phosphorus. We keep the calcium, but we pee out the phosphorus. So as we are controlling the positive ions, negative ions are also, we're busy controlling calcium, we're controlling sodium, we're controlling potassium, as we're controlling those, the negative ions like Cl minus are also controlled, either retained or lost, as they get carried along with those positive ions. Remember, positive ions have a tendency to attract negative ions. Because water is moving between the extracellular fluid and the intracellular fluid compartments, it's happening mostly by osmosis. Then as we are either losing or gaining electrolytes, then water balances are also going to be affected by that. So we see that electrolyte balance and water balance are both very, very closely linked to each other. Okay, so that's pretty much everything I've got to say about water and electrolyte balances. So again, several different hormones related to water and electrolyte balance. Aldosterone, parathyroid hormone, and we've already talked a little bit about PTH. Not PTH, but ADH, there we are, the antidiuretic hormone. So those three hormones are heavily involved in water and electrolyte balance, and in maintaining fluid balance between the extracellular and the intracellular fluid compartments of the body. Okay, so if you have any questions, send me an email and we can talk more.